Right, so I'm keeping going. The Dolphin Song, and this is chapter 10. In the corridor, frightened children in puffy orange life jackets were streaming up to the deck. Some, like Sharon, were a ghastly colour. They wore pyjamas with the buttons done up wrong and dressing gowns with trailing cords, and one boy had on a lone leopard print slipper. Others had flung on mismatched clothes in clashing colours and had sticking up sleep hair. Only Lucy, immaculate in a white tracksuit with a red trim, looked as if she was on her way for a lesson at the tennis club. Most of the girls were crying. Miss Faulkner and Mr. Manning were doing their best to keep everybody calm by telling them that this was nothing more than a routine safety procedure and they'd be back in their bunks in no time. "Walk, don't run," ordered the teacher, trying to make herself heard above the racket of the siren. "No, Boise, you can't bring your suitcase. You know what? Yes, you can bring Pooh Bear." Martine darted unnoticed through a side door. Her survival kit had been around her waist for the entire duration of the trip, as she'd promised Tendai it would be, but she'd taken it off to shower before dinner and had forgotten to put it back on again. In the event this was a real emergency, she wanted it with her. The siren's insistent blare had shut off, and the cabins were eerily quiet. Martine was reminded unpleasantly of a ship disaster film she'd watched with her parents. She took the survival kit from behind the locker where she'd hidden it and tied it securely around her waist. Then she put on a wind cheater. As a sort of tribute to Grace, she'd put the forlorn remnants of her plant in a blue mineral water bottle Alberta had given her. The bottle had toppled over and was lying in a puddle on the floor. Martine wrapped the leaves in Ben's bandana again and added them to her survival kit. She felt a little silly doing it, but there was something about the wisp of plant that made her feel connected to Grace and Salbona. The last thing she did was take off her shoes. She always felt better barefoot. She was on her way to join her classmates when she heard voices coming from the recreation room. "But don't you think we should go up to the deck?" Luke was saying, "What if it's serious? What if the ship is sinking? We miss getting on the lifeboat, and anyway, won't they take a roll call?" Claudius laughed. "Please tell me you're kidding." "You are kidding, aren't you? This is a drill, that's all it is. Or maybe it's just some teacher who knows nothing about the sea getting into a panic over a breeze and a bit of rain. This is nothing compared to some of the storms I've been through on our yacht. There's no way I'm going out there and getting drenched to the skin for nothing. I'm going to stay where it's warm and dry and watch a film." "Look, I'm sorry, but I have to go check on Lucy," Luke said apologetically. "Even if it is only a drill, she'll still be scared." "Hey, no hard feelings," Claudius told him. "See you in 10 minutes. Anxious to avoid being seen by either boy, Martine skipped nimbly up to the deck. She was almost flattened by the force of the storm, which lunged at her out of the night. In seconds, her jeans were soaked through. Luke pushed past her, shielding his face from the onslaught. He leaned into the wind and headed for the prow, where the rest of the children were gathered in a dripping bunch outlined against the torrid sky. They appeared to be receiving emergency evacuation instructions from a couple of crew members. Lucy threw her arms around her twin and handed him the life jacket she'd been keeping for him. Even through the rain and from a distance, Martine could see how ecstatic she was to see him. And she thought how great it must be to have someone who loved you unconditionally no matter what. That made her remember Jemmy, and she was glad that at least one creature on earth loved her that way, unconditionally. Miss Faulkner and Mr. Manning emerged from the doorway behind Martine. "You've checked every cabin," Miss Faulkner was saying. Her red curls waved madly in the wind. "You're absolutely sure there's nobody left below deck?" Martine wondered what had become of Claudius. As much as she disliked him, she knew she should tell Miss Faulkner he was planning to stay in the rec room for the duration of the storm. But before she could say anything, the teacher let out a startled shriek. "Martine, where is your life jacket? Where are your shoes? Lord, give me strength. What are you doing here? Why aren't—" The rest of her tirade was drowned by the screech of splitting metal. Jake Emery, who had been leaning over the edge of the ship, transfixed by the raging sea, jumped back, a horrified look on his face. A section of rail had torn loose and was swinging like a gate in the gale. Grace's words came back to Martine. "Beware of the boat fence." The boat fence, of course, it was a railing around the ship. How could she have been so blind? How could she have missed something so obvious? The railing was going to be the cause of a catastrophe. Martine started forward, but Miss Faulkner grabbed her by the arm. "Oh, no, you don't," she cried. "You're not going anywhere until you've got a life jacket on." Martine tried to twist away, but Miss Faulkner was surprisingly strong. "The guardrail," Martine screamed in the direction of the kids near the prow, cupping a hand over her mouth. "Get away from the guardrail!" But the wind and the roaring sea swallowed her words, and the only one to look her way was Ben. The ship pitched sharply. Miss Faulkner lost her balance and was forced to let go of Martine to save herself. The children near her railing went down like dominoes. Through slanting sheets of rain, Martine saw Ben start towards her. She blinked, and he was gone. She blinked again, but he was definitely gone. Concerned that he might somehow have fallen overboard, Martine leapt out of range of Miss Faulkner's clutching fingers and started running along the slippery deck, ignoring her teacher's enraged shouts. The pelting rain stung her face. Beneath her feet the ship rolled and shuddered, and foaming crests of waves shot so high above the sides of the ship there might have been tsunamis. 2 sailors were untying the lifeboat. That's when the severity of the crisis really came home to Martine. If the storm didn't abate soon, she could end up living her nightmare. She rounded the ship's funnel and stopped short. 2 figures, one large and one much smaller, were wrestling in darkness. Lashed by the driving rain, Claudius and Ben. "Give it to me, you little runt," panted Claudius as he wrenched at Ben's life jacket, trying to pull it off by brute force. Ben wriggled out of Claudius's desperate grip and held up a hand in a gesture of surrender. There was a faint smile on his lips. The look he gave the bigger boy spoke so many volumes that it rendered Martine, who had been about to intervene, temporarily paralyzed. Mainly, it was a look of pity. It was a look that said, if you want this life jacket so much as you're prepared to do this terrible thing, you need it much more than I do. Then he unzipped the orange vest and handed it to Claudius. Claudius snatched it from him without a word, pulled it on over his tubby frame, and stumbled away into the rain-swept night. Martine went up to Ben. She was sickened by what she'd seen. She wanted to rush after Claudius and pound her fists against his meaty back or rant to Ben about how evil he was. But she knew Ben wouldn't appreciate either, so she just said, "Don't worry, I don't have a life jacket either," which she knew was a bit lame, because why would it be of any comfort to him that she too was without a safety vest? The same thought must have occurred to him because his mouth curled up at the corners, and he replied, "Well, that's okay then." Another tsunami-like wave rose into the night, its crest glistening like shaving foam. Martine remembered that she was supposed to be trying to move everyone away from the railings. Hurriedly, she told Ben about Grace's warning, and together they pushed into the teeth of the gale. Their progress was slowed by the sheer volume of water swirling around their ankles. They were within reach of their classmates when the ship dipped so steeply it seemed certain it was going to upend. One moment Martine was straining to stay upright on the waterlogged deck, the next the deck wasn't there. The momentum of their run carried her and Ben helplessly forward, and they collided with a tangle of bodies. There was a screech of tearing metal, and the entire rail gave way. Next time Martine looked, some of the children didn't seem to be there anymore. Before she could fully comprehend what was happening, the deck was dropping away again. Once more, Martine had the feeling that time had slowed to a crawl. First, she grabbed at a steel post in a bid to save herself. It came away in her hand. Secondly, she took in that the din on the boat, the slashing rain, the roaring sea, the screams and yells was hurting her ears. Finally, Martine noticed that the 2 girls in front of her, the last line of resistance between her and the witch's cauldron of ocean, had lost their grip on the slippery edge and were on their way overboard. Then time speeded up again, and she was plunging after them, tumbling headfirst into the darkness, and the seething, sucking sea was reaching up to claim her. Whoa. Chapter 11. Let's keep going. Concrete. That's what went through Martine's mind. When you hit water from a great height, it felt like concrete. It almost winded her. The icy shock of it blasted the remaining air from her lungs, and before she knew it, she was spinning helplessly into the jet-black deep, dropping like a human anchor until she was sure she'd hit the ocean floor 10,000 leagues under the sea. Then just as suddenly she was shooting up again, flailing, spitting salt water, gasping for breath. Already the ship was further away than she could ever have believed was possible, but was still within reach. She could see people scurrying around the deck. They were throwing lines and lowering a lifeboat. A weaving searchlight illuminated pale heads bobbing in the surrounding sea. Martine struck out in their direction, but her clothes and the survival kit weighed her down and restricted her movements. And she could have been a cork on a rapid for all the impression her efforts made on the treacle-black waves. She went to unbuckle the pouch, but something stopped her. "Keep your survival kit with you." For when you most need it, little one, Tendai had told her, when you need it to survive. He hadn't said anything about what to do if the kid supposed to save you was dragging you down to the bottom of the sea, but there was no denying that this was a survival situation if ever there was one. Martine was panic-stricken. She yelled for help, but it was a feeble yell because she was beyond the arc of the searchlights, and she knew with nauseating certainty that they wouldn't be able to hear her on deck. That if she couldn't reach the boat before the waves obscured her, she'd be left alone in the raging ocean in the middle of the night, waiting to drown or be eaten by sharks. Fear lent her energy. She started to swim again. To distract herself, she did her best to imagine she was competing in the school gala. But that only reminded her of how she always came last, so she put her head down and concentrated instead on doing one stroke at a time. When she judged she must be nearing the lifeboat, she stopped and trod water. Her chest constricted with shock. The ship was a fast-shrinking square of light on the horizon. Martine wiped the salt water from her eyes. And when a swell lifted her up again, squinted into the darkness. But there was no mistake. The current and the huge waves had swept her away. At least a mile lay between her and any hope of rescue. She was on her own. Battling to stay afloat, Martine started to cry. Breaking down went against everything she knew about survival, the most crucial part of which was staying calm and not giving up. But she couldn't help it. It would take a miracle to save her now. Already she was completely exhausted. She'd swallowed gallons of seawater, and she was so cold she didn't know which was going to get her first, hypothermia or the sharks that lurked in the depths below. She could imagine them circling in preparation for charging at her the way the great white had hurtled at Norm in Shark Alley, their deep-set dead eyes on her flapping white limbs. She tried to paddle more slowly and to tuck her legs up to minimize the area of flesh they had to attack, but all that happened was that she sank. Terrified, she clawed her way to the surface. She was almost there when there was an explosion of bubbles and a shining streak past her, a sort of oceanic shooting star. Then it swooped the other way. Martine tried to focus to see it through the darkness and rain, but the whale-tail strength of the wave shoved her back and forth, and she caught only glimpses of a long, swiftly moving shape glowing with some unearthly light. Instinct told Martine that if she could only reach the shining thing, it would mean survival, but she kept sinking. No matter how hard she struggled, it stayed tantalizingly out of reach. And with every passing second, the chill was numbing her limbs, making the sea seem heavy, as if she was swimming through snow. She was so tired that she knew she wouldn't be able to fight for much longer. Soon she'd have to stop paddling. And then the edges of Martine's vision wavered and darkness closed in. It was Cornwall, she remembered first, a spring day on Porthmeor Beach in St. Ives before the summer madness when the tourists came. Martine had been standing on the apricot sand reaching for a honeycomb ice cream Mum had brought her when a fat seagull had swooped down and snatched it. But her dismay had quickly turned to laughter. While the seagull was gloating over its spoils on a nearby rooftop, sending ear-piercing screeches in their direction, another seagull had reached over and swallowed the cone in a single gulp. By then, Martine and her dad had decided it was too chilly for ice cream anyway. So the three of them had spent the rest of the afternoon scoffing warm scones heaped with strawberry jam and clotted cream in a cozy harbour cafe, watching the tide spin around the rainbow-painted fishing boats. Martine remembered it as a day of perfect happiness. Other memories followed, flickering through her head like a well-loved home movie. There was the magical night on the game reserve when she'd woken from a dead faint to find the white giraffe towering over her, her coat shimmering like sun on snow, his silver patches tinged with cinnamon, the exhilaration she'd felt the first time she rode him, the way they'd swept across the moonlit savannah, Jemmy galloping with a rocking horse stride. Next, and as vividly as if it was happening then, Martine felt electricity crackle through her, just as it had when Grace placed a hand on her forehead on the day she arrived in Africa. The gift can be a blessing or a curse, the Sangoma had warned her. Make your decisions wisely. The scene changed, and Martine relived the horror of the fire and the last time she saw her parents when her father had hugged her goodnight and told her he loved her. She'd been about to go into her bedroom when he'd said, "You have to trust, Martine. Everything happens for a reason." And afterwards she thought how odd it was that he should say it then at that precise moment. Last, and if she was watching from above, she saw herself as a baby. She was in her mother's arms in the living room at Sawubona. Mum was holding her up to the window so she could glimpse the animals. Lions beside zebras, leopards beside springbok, baboons beside warthogs lined up along the game fence, their eyes trained on the house. See that beautiful girl, Veronica murmured. That's your destiny. And almost imperceptibly she had added, but not if I can stop it. Gradually, Martine became aware that she was being raised to the surface of the sea by something immensely strong and yet infinitely gentle, like angels' wings. A blast of stormy air hit her face and shocked her back to life, and then she was coughing up seawater and sucking oxygen into her burning lungs. She was draped across something solid and slippery. For a minute she lay there, grateful for the opportunity to rest and breathe and be partially out of the freezing water. Then the solid thing moved. Martine, who'd been idly speculating she had happened upon a piece of floating wreckage, or miracle of miracles, a lifeboat, nearly passed out with fright. She struggled upright. The clouds cleared from her vision, and she realized she was holding onto a large dorsal fin. A shark. She was sitting on a shark. Then her nose poked above the water and emitted a few clicks and squeaks, and Martine was filled with an intense relief. In spite of her predicament, she laughed out loud. She'd been rescued by a dolphin. All of a sudden, it didn't seem so bad that she was in the middle of the ocean, in the middle of the night with the ship long gone. She wasn't sure what was going to become of her now, but whatever it was, it had to be better than being snacked on by sharks. Even as she was congratulating herself on this piece of good fortune, a movement in the blue-black water caught Martine's eyes. A dorsal fin cruised slowly by. She tried to see it clearly. Surely it was another dolphin. Surely it was a friend come to join her savior. But the dorsal fin began to circle, and soon it was joined by a second fin, and a third, fourth, fifth, and sixth. In a matter of minutes, she and the dolphin were ring-fenced in a deadly shark corral. Martine was already shaking with cold and exertion, but now she began to shiver so violently at the thought that she might after all be torn apart in a feeding frenzy of great whites. Greg's talk about their many good qualities had failed to reassure her, and she was worried she might slip off the dolphin. And anyway, what was to prevent her newfound friend from darting away to save itself, abandoning her to her fate? But the dolphin stayed with her, although it made squeaks of alarm at the encroaching sharks. Suddenly the sharks melted away. Nothing happened for a moment, and then over the sighing of the sea, Martine heard a tremendous splashing. What she saw next took her breath away. Through the wild waves came what must have been 100 dolphins, their silhouettes outlined in silver. They were leaping, dancing, and cavorting, and their silvery arcs freeze-framed against the midnight ocean, and the scudding storm clouds were beyond beautiful. Martine sat perfectly still, awed by the spectacle. As they drew nearer, she could hear them communicating with one another. And it sounded to her like music, like singing. And whether or not it was her imagination, she fancied they were singing in Xhosa, because their clicks were not dissimilar to the lovely clicks made by African singers she'd heard. And that strangely calmed her and made her feel that somehow, some way, she'd be all right. The dolphins surrounded Martine in their dozens and opened their smiling mouths and squeaked and whistled, almost as if they were greeting her. That was amazing enough, especially because they allowed her to reach down and stroke their satin skins. But then Martine noticed that several of the dolphins were transporting passengers. The other kids. Most seemed barely conscious. A couple cast desperate glances in her direction, blinked in acknowledgement, and resumed their frozen postures on the dolphins' backs, sobbing quietly. Martine counted 5 figures, but as far as she could tell, Ben wasn't among them. What if he hadn't been saved? What if he were lost at sea? What if he was gone forever? She tried to imagine life without the boy, who in the shortest possible time had come to mean so much to her, and was taken aback by the pain that suddenly speared her heart. After all, it's not as if she really knew him. Ben wasn't someone it was easy to get to know. She always had the impression that he was watching the world from some peaceful place inside himself. Martine was so busy agonizing over Ben and whether or not she could have interpreted Grace's clue sooner and prevented the whole disaster that she didn't notice a new dolphin entering the ranks of those around her until it actually nudged her foot. Ben was slumped on its back. By the look of him, he was drowned or very close to it. "Ben," cried Martine hysterically, "Ben, wake up! Please be alive! Please be alive!" When he didn't respond, she shook him hard. She was so afraid that this was to be her fate, to lose everyone she ever cared about, that she forgot everything she knew about first aid. Ben sat up startled, his eyes glazed. She could see him trying to make sense of the scene around him. Perhaps he, like her, had dreamed he was somewhere else. Slowly his expression began to register the same incredulity Martine had experienced as he took in the fact that not only was he surrounded by dolphins, he was on the back of one. Then he saw Martine herself. Wordlessly, he reached for her hand. He made no effort to disguise how frightened he was, nor how happy he was to see her, and that made Martine cry again. And for a while they just rode along like that, holding hands. After a while, Martine felt shy, which she knew was ridiculous under the circumstances, but she let go of his fingers and said, "What time do you think it is?" Ben managed a weary smile. "Why, have you got an appointment?" But he went on quickly. "We can probably work it out. It was about 9:30 when the siren went off, and we've probably been in the water for 2 or 3 hours. Judging by the position of the moon, I'd say it's between midnight and 1 in the morning." Martine fell silent again, and the two of them concentrated on staying awake so they could watch over the others. After a while, the numbing cold and the easy rhythm of the dolphins and the endless rolling ocean, almost flat now that the storm had passed over, had a soporific effect. They began to murmur to themselves about mirages they glimpsed of palm-fringed islands, or steaming bubble baths, or rescue parties bearing mugs of hot chocolate and thick, soft blankets. So that when a lighthouse did actually loom into view atop a hulking dark outline of land ragged with palms, they thought it was just another mirage. The dolphins slowed and stopped. When their passengers didn't respond, they deposited them unceremoniously in the shallows. And even when the 7 frozen figures felt solid sand beneath them, even then they couldn't believe it was real, because the rocking motion of the sea had infused their bodies, and they still felt as though they were floating. It was all any of them could do to crawl beyond the fringe of surf, which they did without speaking, the stronger ones helping the others. Then they collapsed on the darkened beach. Martine's muscles were so sore and wobbly that those final few steps were the most arduous of the night. The air was fragrant and balmy, but the chill had penetrated to the very marrow of her bones, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. When she could go no further, she toppled onto the pillowy sand. Ben dragged her a bit further beyond the tide's reach, and then he flopped down a few feet away from her. As weak as he was, there was something about his presence which made Martine feel protected. Moments before she lost consciousness, she whispered to him, "Ben, weren't you afraid of dying?" "No," he said quietly. "I was afraid of not living." Martine fell into a sleep which was closer to a coma, with the palm fronds rattling like wind chimes in the breeze, and her head full of dolphin song. Wow.